She said it so quietly that only he heard it. 5 words, barely above a breath, delivered in the half-second between the crystal flute reaching his lips and the moment his throat would have closed. Theodore Ashworth, 64 years old, $6.2 billion on the last Forbes list, surrounded by 200 guests in the grand ballroom of his own estate, froze, not because of the words alone, because of the girl who said them. She was 14 years old, the daughter of one of his catering staff who should not have been in that ballroom at all, who had slipped through a service door 20 minutes earlier for reasons he was about to understand completely. His hand hung suspended. The champagne caught the light. Around him, 200 guests held their glasses aloft, waiting for the toast to finish. In the wings, one person watched the frozen tableau with an expression that could only be described as the look of a plan that had just encountered the one variable it hadn't accounted for. Theodore Ashworth looked down at the small girl standing at his elbow. Her eyes were steady, her hands at her sides were not trembling. She had walked through a room full of people she didn't know, at an event she had no business attending, to stop a man she'd met exactly once from drinking something that would have killed him before the night was over. He had no idea who she was. He was about to find out. 7 months earlier, the first time Adiz Okafor stepped inside the Ashworth estate, she was not supposed to be there either. Her mother, Grace Okafor, had been running a catering operation for 11 years out of a commercial kitchen in Trenton, New Jersey, the kind of business built not on capital, but on reputation, word by word, event by event. The way Black women have always built things in industries that weren't designed to welcome them. Grace had started with church dinners and retirement parties and worked her way up over a decade to corporate luncheons, wedding receptions, and, eventually, the category of client whose name required a background check just to park on their property. The Ashworth estate assignment had come through events coordinator Grace had worked with for 6 years, and it was the largest single contract Grace had ever signed, a 3-day private conference for 40 senior executives. Accommodation, meals, evening events, the kind of contract that could change the scale of a business if everything went right, and destroy it if anything went wrong. Grace had brought Adiz on the first day of setup because school was out, because the babysitter had canceled, and because Adiz, who was 13 at the time, and who her teachers described, uniformly, as one of the most observant students they had encountered in 20 years of teaching, was old enough to stay out of the way and help with small tasks, and could be trusted not to cause a problem. She had assigned her daughter to the linen station, folding napkins in a service corridor, and instructed her, "Stay in this hallway, do not wander, do not speak to the clients, do not touch anything that isn't linen." Adiz had folded napkins for 11 minutes. Then she had begun to notice things. She noticed them the way she noticed everything, quietly, completely, the way a naturalist notices an ecosystem, cataloging without judgment until the pattern became clear enough to have meaning. She noticed the estate's head of private security, a man named Victor Sloan, moving through the service corridors at intervals that didn't match the event schedule. She noticed the estate's catering liaison, a woman named Helen Marsh, who had been working with the Ashworth household for 4 years, receiving a phone call that made her step behind a door and lower her voice in the way people lower their voices when they don't want to be overheard, but are not quite afraid enough to leave the building. She noticed that the specific champagne allocated to Theodore Ashworth's personal service, a 1998 vintage stored separately from the general event stock, poured only for the host from a designated bottle, had been accessed by someone who was not a member of Grace's catering team between 3 and 4 p.m. on that first afternoon. She knew it wasn't Grace's team because she knew every face on Grace's team. Her mother had been assembling and reassembling the same core group of 8 people for years. Adiz knew them all, and the person she had seen entering the private cellar where the designated bottle was stored was none of them. She hadn't said anything that first day. She was 13 years old, and she had no proof of anything, and she was not supposed to be in the building, and her mother would have been horrified. She had told herself she was wrong, that she had misidentified someone, that there was an innocent explanation. But she had seen what she had seen. The Ashworth estate ran on systems, the way all large private properties run on systems, quietly, mostly invisibly, with the particular efficiency of a well-resourced household that has been managed by the same core staff for years. Theodore Ashworth had built his fortune in pharmaceutical distribution, a business that operated at the intersection of supply chain logistics and regulatory compliance, and which had made him, by his mid-40s, the kind of wealthy that insulated a person from almost every ordinary inconvenience. He was not an easy man. His executives described him privately as demanding, exacting, and almost entirely incapable of tolerating inefficiency. His staff described him, when they were honest, as fair, which in their world was the higher compliment. He paid well. He held people to standards. He did not cross lines. He also, and this would matter later, had a son. Preston Ashworth was 31 years old and had spent that 31 years in the specific condition of a man who knew the inheritance was coming and could not quite decide whether to earn it or simply wait. He had been given positions in the company, vice president of this, director of that, and had occupied them with the restless energy of someone performing a role rather than living one. He had Theodore's instincts for business in the way that a copy has an original's features, recognizable, but without the depth. And he had for 3 years been quietly in conversation with a competitor of his father's about the terms under which a hostile acquisition of Ashworth Pharmaceuticals might be structured. An acquisition that would require Theodore to be incapacitated, incompetent, or dead before Preston turned 35 and the estate trust restructured around his direct control. Victor Sloan had been introduced to Preston 18 months ago through a private channel that bore no official connection to either man's documented life. He was not a legitimate security professional. He had the paperwork of one, the licenses, the background, the references, but these were the products of a fabrication operation that served a specific and very small clientele, people with money who needed things done that money alone could not accomplish. Sloan had been placed in the Ashworth household as head of private security through a recommendation that Theodore had received from someone he trusted, which was how these things were always done. He had been in place for 14 months before the 3-day executive conference that brought Grace Okafor's catering team onto the estate. The plan was simple in the way that plans are simple, when they have been engineered by people with sufficient resources, a compound introduced to a specific bottle of champagne. A champagne that only Theodore drank, poured from a bottle only he used, at a private estate where the staff had been vetted and the access controlled, that is, by Victor Sloan, which meant the access was not controlled at all. The compound would not kill him immediately. That was the point. It would produce symptoms consistent with a progressive neurological condition, the kind that made a man's judgment unreliable and made his long-term cognitive competence a subject of board-level concern. Over months, with continued exposure, it would do what it was designed to do, and Preston Ashworth would be positioned with medical documentation Sloan's network could produce to argue for a transfer of executive control that would make the hostile acquisition possible on terms his father would never have agreed to while healthy. It was, in the architecture of its ambition, a version of something Adaze Okafor had never read about. But she had seen Victor Sloan in the cellar, and she had a memory that did not release things. She had gone home after that first day and written down everything. Not in a diary, in a notebook she kept for exactly this kind of accumulation. The kind of record-keeping she'd started at 11 because her mother had told her once that the difference between a feeling and a fact was documentation. She wrote down the time, 3:47 p.m., the location, private cellar, east corridor, second door from the stairwell. The person, male, approximately 6 feet, dark jacket, silver clip on his left lapel that matched the identification badge worn by the estate security staff. The duration of access between 4 and 7 minutes based on when she had seen him enter and when she had seen him leave. She had not told her mother. She had not told anyone. She was 13 years old and she had written a description in a notebook and gone to sleep. But she had also, over the following 7 months, paid attention. She came back to the estate 3 more times with Grace's catering team. A quarterly board dinner in October, a private family event in December, and a New Year's reception that ran to 80 guests. Each time she watched Victor Sloan, she learned his patterns the way she learned everything, methodically, patiently, without letting the accumulation of detail collapse into premature conclusion. She noted his access to the private cellar. She noted his communication patterns, who he called, when from which locations on the estate. She noted that Helen Marsh, the catering liaison, appeared to have been frightened of something since October, in ways that had not been visible in July. And in January, 3 weeks before the estate's annual gala, the one where Theodore Ashworth would make his traditional birthday toast with the 1998 vintage from the designated bottle, she had seen something she could not explain away. She had been in the service corridor, legitimate this time, helping her mother with a linen delivery. When she had passed the partially open door of a storage room and seen Victor Sloan and a man she didn't recognize standing over a table with a bottle of champagne and two items she recognized from the chemistry unit she had just completed at school, a small glass vial and a syringe. Her breath had caught. Everything she had been writing down for 7 months became, in that moment, a single clear sentence. She had told her mother that night, all of it. The notebook, the July observation, the 7 months of accumulated detail, the January storage room. Grace Okafor had sat at the kitchen table and listened with the complete stillness of a woman trying to hold something enormous without dropping it. Then she had asked 3 questions. Was Adaze certain about what she'd seen in July? Yes. Was she certain about January? Yes. Did she understand what she was saying about a man who employed powerful people and could make their lives very difficult if she was wrong? Adaze had looked at her mother and said, "I'm not wrong." Grace had called her attorney the next morning. The attorney had referred her to a contact at the state attorney general's office. The state AG's office had, after 2 conversations and a review of Adaze's notebook, referred the matter to the FBI's white-collar crimes division, who had opened an investigation with a speed that told Grace, without anyone saying so directly, that some of what her daughter had documented was not entirely new information. The investigation had been running for 3 weeks when the gala date arrived. The FBI agents handling the case had asked Grace and Adaze to continue as planned, attend the gala, maintain the appearance of normal, do not confront anyone, do not deviate from the event schedule. They would have personnel on site. They would handle what needed to be handled. What they had not handled, in the careful architecture of their plan, was the gap between their timeline and Theodore Ashworth's tradition. He always made the birthday toast at exactly 9 o'clock. The agent's signal to move on Sloan was scheduled for 9:15, following a coordinated approach designed to minimize disruption to the 200 guests and ensure clean evidence handling. At 8:58, Theodore Ashworth raised his glass. Adaze Okafor was standing 8 feet away in a service corridor in a black catering apron, watching through a gap in the ballroom door. When she did the math, 15 minutes. The gap between what the agents had planned and what was about to happen was 15 minutes. She looked for her mother. Grace was across the ballroom at the service station. She looked for any face she recognized from the FBI briefings. She found none in the 10 seconds she had. She pushed open the ballroom door. She walked through 200 people in a service apron, 14 years old, in a room full of wealth and power, and the particular social architecture of an event where everyone knew their place and hers was behind a door. She walked through it without stopping, without looking at anything but the back of Theodore Ashworth's silver head at the front of the room. She reached him in 31 seconds. She said 5 words into the space between his flute and his lips. "Don't drink that, sir." Theodore Ashworth looked down at the girl for 2 full seconds. Something in his face moved. Not dismissal, not irritation, but the particular stillness of a man whose instincts had kept him alive in business for 40 years, registering that something was true that he did not yet understand. He lowered the glass. The room had gone very quiet. From somewhere near the east entrance, a door opened. 2 men who had not been at this event in any visible capacity moved through the guest perimeter with the purposeful quiet of professionals who have just had their timeline moved. Victor Sloan, standing at the edge of the event staff position 40 feet away, saw them before they reached him. His jaw set. He did not run. There was nowhere to run in a room with 6 exits and 6 agents who had been briefed. The click of handcuffs in a silent ballroom carries further than you expect. 200 guests turned. At the sound, Theodore Ashworth turned. He was still holding the champagne glass he had not drunk from. He looked at the man being escorted through his ballroom in restraints. His head of private security, the man who had come with a trusted recommendation, the man who had been inside his house for 14 months. And his face moved through something profound and slow. The understanding of how close the margin had been, the weight of what 14 months of proximity to a person who meant him harm actually meant, the particular cold of realizing that the trust you'd placed and the systems you'd built and the resources you'd deployed had been insufficient, and that a 14-year-old girl in a catering apron had closed the gap. He looked at Adez. She looked back at him, steady the way she looked at everything. "What's your name?" he said. "Adez Okafor." She said it clearly, the full name, the name her mother had given her, which meant daughter of wealth in Igbo, and which she had spent 14 years learning to say without apology in rooms where people found it difficult. Theodore Ashworth said, "How long have you known?" 7 months, she said. "I've been writing it down." He looked at her for a long moment. 200 people in the room, and it was quiet the way rooms go quiet when something real is happening in them. Then he said, to no one in particular, and everyone present, "Someone get her mother." Preston Ashworth was arrested at his apartment in Manhattan at 11:17 that evening. The charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted poisoning, and a federal count related to the hostile acquisition communications, were filed the following morning. The case, when it eventually went to trial 14 months later, drew the kind of coverage that corporate crime cases draw when they involve a son, a father, and a fortune that had taken a lifetime to build. Preston's attorney argued diminished responsibility and the particular pathology of growing up in the shadow of an enormous inheritance. The jury deliberated for 9 hours and convicted on all counts. 8 years, federal sentence, no parole on the fraud charge. Victor Sloan cooperated with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence that was still, by any ordinary measure, the end of his professional life. Helen Marsh, who had been aware of Sloan's presence but not of the specific plan and had been too frightened to report what she suspected, cooperated fully and was granted immunity. She resigned from the Ashworth estate and, by all accounts, spent the following year doing something that looked, from the outside, like a person rebuilding their relationship with their own conscience. Theodore Ashworth gave a statement to the press that was, for a man of his characteristic brevity, long. He described the investigation, acknowledged the role of the FBI, and then, in the sentence that every outlet pulled for their headline, said, "A 14-year-old girl with a notebook and 7 months of patience saved my life. I intend to make sure she has every resource she needs to do whatever she decides to do next." He was not speaking metaphorically. Adez Okafor was 15 when she sat across from Theodore Ashworth in his study, the formal one, the mahogany and leather room that conveyed, without ambiguity, the weight of what was transacted inside it, and listened to what he was offering: a full educational trust, private school for the remainder of secondary education, wherever she wanted to go, university wherever she was accepted, fully funded, a research stipend for any scientific or investigative program she wished to pursue, and, if she wanted it, a standing invitation to advise the Ashworth Foundation's newly established Ethics and Oversight Committee, the one he was building in the specific shape of the gap that had allowed 14 months of harm to accumulate inside his own household. She had asked for 48 hours to think about it. He had said, of course. She had gone home and talked to her mother at the kitchen table until midnight, the same table where she had laid out 7 months of documentation and watched Grace Okafor hold something enormous without dropping it. Grace had said, "Take what's real and leave what's performance." They had spent an hour separating the two. The educational trust was real. The foundation advisory position was real, if unusual. The rest, the framing, the press, the narrative of the billionaire and the girl who saved him, was the part that required navigation, because Adez understood, at 15, with the same clarity she brought to everything, that being someone's story was different from living your own. She accepted the educational trust. She accepted the advisory position on 2 conditions: that her role be substantive rather than symbolic, and that her mother's catering company receive a multi-year contract with the Ashworth estate and foundation events that reflected the market rate for the quality of work Grace Okafor had been delivering for 11 years. Theodore Ashworth had looked at her across the mahogany desk and said, "Done," without hesitation, the way a man agrees to terms that are correct. Adez Okafor went to school in the fall. She studied chemistry and forensic science and a course in investigative methodology that she later described as the first formal name she'd encountered for something she'd been doing since she was 11. She remained, as she had always been, one of the most observant students her teachers had ever encountered. And every year, on the anniversary of the night in the ballroom, Grace Okafor made Sunday dinner, the full spread, the kind that required all day and meant something. And they ate together in the kitchen of the apartment in Trenton, and talked about everything and nothing in the way that mothers and daughters talk when they have been through something together that marked them both and have found on the other side of it that they are still entirely themselves. Grace would always say at some point in the evening that she should never have brought a daze to that first setup day, that it had been irresponsible, that a commercial kitchen was no place for a 13-year-old on a summer afternoon. A daze would always say, I know, but also, I'm glad. And Grace, every year, would shake her head and smile in the particular way of a mother who has raised someone whose gifts exceed her own, and knows it, and would not change a single thing. The notebook was in a box in Daze's room, all the entries dated and precise. July through January, the times, the locations, the observations, the accumulated architecture of 7 months of paying attention to something most adults had missed. She kept it not as evidence, as a reminder that the difference between a feeling and a fact was documentation, that patience was a form of power, that sometimes the smallest person in the room is the only one standing in exactly the right place to see what everyone else has missed. And that 5 words said quietly at precisely the right moment can stop everything.